Billionaire finds homeless boy at daughter's grave, but what he discovers is scarier than death. Grief is an abyss with no end. For a father who has buried his child, sorrow becomes a relentless shadow, whispering of what could have been. But when a billionaire visits his daughter's grave, expecting only the silence of her absence, he stumbles upon something he could never have imagined. There, before the headstone, sits a homeless boy. He does not beg, he does not plead. He simply clutches something too precious to be in his hands, something that once belonged to the daughter this man lost forever, or so he believed. What does this boy know? How did he get that object? And more terrifying than death itself, what hidden truth is about to be unveiled? This is yet another beautiful story from Living Narratives, where you truly feel the power of stories that make you reflect on life. Tell us where you're watching from, and prepare yourself for a tale that will shake you to your core. Richard walked slowly between the rows of tombstones, his mind weighed down by the years that had dragged on since Emily's passing. He was not a man who easily succumbed to emotion, but something inside him burned differently that day. Perhaps it was the realization that, despite all this time, he still had no real answers. His eyes locked onto the grave ahead, where the cold letters carved into marble etched his daughter's name like an unrelenting sentence. But then he stopped, his breath caught in his chest. Someone was there. A frail boy, dirty, dressed in worn-out clothes, sat in front of Emily's tombstone, rocking slightly as he mumbled words Richard could not make out. The billionaire's brows furrowed, his gaze narrowing as he took in the eerie sight before him. Who was this boy? And what the hell was he doing at his daughter's grave? For a moment, Richard considered ignoring the boy and proceeding with his visit. After all, what could a homeless kid possibly know? But something about the way the boy sat there unsettled him. There was a disturbing familiarity in his presence, a kind of intimacy with that place that made no sense. Richard cleared his throat, expecting the boy to acknowledge him, but he remained unmoved, still murmuring under his breath. That irritated him. Richard was not a man used to being ignored. When he spoke, people listened. Impatience flared in his chest, and he took a step forward, his voice sharper than he intended. "Hey, kid, what are you doing here?" The boy did not immediately react. His fingers remained tightly clenched around something small, hidden within his filthy hands. Then, slowly, without even lifting his eyes, he muttered something. Richard did not catch it at first. The voice was too low. But when Daniel repeated the words, a chill ran down his spine. "You shouldn't have come. She's still here." Richard felt his pulse quicken in a way he had not anticipated. That didn't make sense. He was not a man prone to superstition or paranormal nonsense, but there was no mistaking the certainty in the boy's voice. Emily was here. How? She was dead, buried in the cold earth beneath their feet. He had seen her lifeless body with his own eyes. He had closed the casket himself. His mind immediately sought rational explanations. Was the boy a scam artist? Had someone sent him to torment him? Or worse, had he actually known Emily before she died? Something twisted painfully in Richard's chest at that last possibility. "What did you just say?" His voice came out stronger this time, demanding an answer. The boy, however, did not seem frightened or startled by his presence. He merely tilted his head slightly, as if listening to something distant or someone. Richard's patience, already razor-thin by nature, was quickly running out. He took another step forward, his shadow falling over the boy's small frame. "Listen to me, kid. I don't have time for games. If you know something about Emily, then say it now." Daniel finally turned his face toward him, and for the first time, Richard saw his eyes. Something was wrong. It was not fear, not anger, not even surprise. It was recognition. As if the boy had known exactly who he was long before this encounter, as if he had been waiting for him. "She's still here," Daniel repeated, his voice clearer now. "She told me you'd come." Richard's mind rebelled against those words. He didn't want to hear them. He didn't even want to consider the possibility that there was more to Emily's death than what he had been led to believe. He had spent years trying to suppress the questions that threatened to resurface, but as he looked at the boy, he realized he might never have had the answers that truly mattered. A bitter taste rose in Richard's throat. His instincts screamed at him to walk away, to leave the boy behind and never return. But something inside him refused to retreat. What if there was truth in this madness? What if Emily had tried to say something before she died, something he had ignored? Richard crouched down, his eyes locked onto the boy's, his voice now lower but firm. "What do you mean by that? How did you know my daughter?" Daniel blinked slowly, as if debating whether or not to answer. Then he opened his hand. What Richard saw made his blood run cold. It was a small golden locket, engraved with the initials he would recognize anywhere. Emily never took it off. He had given it to her on her 15th birthday. But that was impossible. He had buried it with her. A tight knot formed in Richard's chest. He took the locket from the boy's hands, turning it between his fingers, searching for a rational explanation. How could it be here? There was an unfamiliar weight to it, as if something was hidden inside. He pressed his fingers around the pendant, trying to pry open a tiny latch he had never noticed before. Daniel simply watched him, unmoving. "She knew you would find it," the boy said, his tone neutral, almost uninterested. "She told me to hold on to it until you were ready." Richard lifted his gaze to him, his mind spinning. Emily had trusted this boy. Why? Who was he to her? And more importantly, ready for what? Richard's hand trembled slightly as he finally opened the secret compartment inside the locket. Inside, there was a tiny piece of folded paper, placed with deliberate care. He hesitated for a moment before pulling it out, his heart pounding like a war drum inside his chest. When he finally unfolded the message, his entire world seemed to shift. The words written there made no sense, or rather, he didn't want them to make sense. He read them once, twice, 3 times, as if expecting the letters to rearrange themselves and form something different. But they didn't. The message was clear and terrifying. "If anything happens to me, don't believe what they tell you." Richard's gaze remained locked onto the boy, his mind racing with questions he did not yet know how to articulate. He had spent years perfecting the ability to read people, to detect lies beneath subtle shifts in expression, but Daniel was unreadable. The boy simply sat there, his small hands still, resting on the locket as if it carried more weight than just its golden frame. Richard clenched his jaw, forcing down the unease that had settled deep in his stomach. He was not a man easily shaken, but something about this encounter, about this child, felt profoundly wrong. He leaned in slightly, his voice controlled but firm. "How did you know my daughter?" The question hung between them, and for the first time, Daniel hesitated. His lips parted slightly, then closed again, as if he was fighting with himself over what to say. Richard narrowed his eyes, his patience wearing thinner with every second of silence. "I asked you a question, boy," he said, his tone sharp, "and I expect an answer." Daniel finally inhaled, his small chest rising with the effort. Then, without looking up, he spoke. "She told me you would come." His voice was barely above a whisper, but Richard heard every word, with clarity that sent another chill through his spine. She told him. His mind immediately rejected the idea. Emily had been gone for too long. There was no way she could have spoken to this boy, not unless... No. Richard refused to entertain such absurdities. The logical part of him clung to reason, to explanations grounded in reality. Emily must have met this boy before her death. That was the only possibility. But why had she never mentioned him? He straightened, folding his arms across his chest. "That doesn't answer my question," he said, his voice steady. "Who are you to her?" Daniel lowered his head, staring at his hands as if the answer was written across his skin. Richard could feel the tension in the air, thickening with every passing second of the boy's hesitation. And then, finally, Daniel spoke again. "She never called me Daniel," he murmured. The words were so soft that Richard barely registered them at first. His brows pulled together, and he took a step closer, trying to make sense of what he had just heard. "What did you say?" Daniel swallowed hard before repeating himself, his voice carrying a weight that Richard couldn't yet define. "She never called me." "Daniel," he said again, this time with more conviction. Richard's pulse pounded against his skull. Every part of him braced for the answer he hadn't realized he was dreading. "Then what did she call you?" he asked, his voice quieter now, almost careful. Daniel finally lifted his gaze, his dark eyes, unreadable, and uttered a name that Richard had never heard before in his life. The name struck him like a physical blow. His breath stalled in his throat, his mind instantly rejecting it. That was impossible. He had never heard that name before, never spoken it, never written it. It was foreign to him, yet Daniel said it with absolute certainty, as if it had always been a part of his reality. Richard's mind raced through every possible connection, every conceivable reason why Emily would have referred to this boy by a name that did not exist in his world. But there was nothing, no relative, no friend, no acquaintance, no childhood companion. It was a name entirely detached from everything Richard knew about Emily's life. "That's not possible," he muttered, shaking his head as if that alone could dispel the growing sense of unease spreading through him. "You're lying." Daniel didn't react. He didn't defend himself. He didn't argue. He simply stared, as if he knew something Richard didn't. The billionaire's hands curled into fists, frustration bleeding into something dangerously close to fear. He had spent years controlling his emotions, his reactions, his world. Nothing and no one dictated how he felt, yet this boy, this nameless, filthy, strange child, had disrupted his reality with nothing but a single word. "Why would she call you that?" he demanded, his voice colder now, harder. Daniel blinked slowly, his posture eerily calm despite the tension radiating off Richard. "Because that's who I am," he said, as if that explained everything. But it didn't. It only deepened the confusion. Richard took a sharp breath, forcing himself to regain control of his thoughts. He was being played. That had to be it. Someone had fed this boy information, planted him here, set up this entire encounter to rattle him. He had enemies, people who would take sick pleasure in seeing him unravel. This was a trick, a game. It had to be. But then Daniel did something that shattered that logic completely. He reached into his pocket and pulled out something small, something so insignificant at first glance that Richard almost dismissed it. But when the boy uncurled his fingers, revealing the object in his palm, the air seemed to shift. Richard's eyes locked onto it, and suddenly his thoughts weren't his own anymore. His mind reeled backward, years folding into themselves. As a memory resurfaced that should not have existed, a small carved wooden figure, handcrafted, simple, familiar, too familiar. His vision swam as his past collided violently with his present. He had seen that figure before. He had held it. And yet, that wasn't possible. That figure was gone. Buried, forgotten, just like the name Daniel had spoken. Richard took a step back, his breath coming faster now, his carefully constructed walls cracking. He could not have seen that before. He could not have held it. That memory was not real. But his reaction betrayed him. Daniel saw it, and for the first time, a flicker of something that almost resembled pity crossed the boy's face. "You remember now, don't you?" he asked quietly. Richard swallowed, his throat dry as sandpaper, his heart hammering against his ribs. "No," he said, but it sounded weak, even to his own ears. Daniel's gaze didn't waver. "You will," he said. And then, without another word, he closed his fingers around the figure, as if sealing away a past that Richard was no longer certain had ever been his to forget. "You need to leave," Richard said, his voice firm, eyes locked onto the boy, who still hadn't moved from where he sat in front of Emily's grave. His patience had already thinned to a fragile thread, and he refused to entertain this nonsense any longer. This entire encounter had been unsettling enough. But now, with the strange name the boy had spoken lingering in his mind, like an itch he couldn't scratch, Richard needed distance. He wasn't a man who allowed himself to be rattled, and yet here he was, staring at a filthy, nameless child who had somehow cracked open a memory Richard wasn't even sure was his own. He clenched his jaw, the frustration clear in his posture. "Go," he repeated more forcefully this time. "I don't care where. Just don't be here when I return." The boy blinked slowly, almost as if he had been expecting this reaction all along. And then, without a word, he stood. No resistance, no hesitation, just a quiet compliance that felt wrong. Richard exhaled sharply and turned his back, walking away without another glance, convinced that whatever hold this child had on his mind would vanish once he was gone. Richard had barely closed the door to his home when exhaustion hit him like a slow, creeping wave. His chest felt tight, his body heavy, as if something unseen had latched onto him since the moment he saw that boy. His rational mind fought to dismiss it as a coincidence, a meaningless interaction with a disturbed child. But no matter how much he wanted to let it go, he couldn't. The name the boy had spoken, that name that shouldn't have meant anything, kept resurfacing, gnawing at the edges of his thoughts. He made his way to his study, pouring himself a glass of whiskey, the amber liquid swirling in the dim light. He stared at the framed photo on his desk, Emily's face forever frozen in time, her bright smile so painfully familiar yet distant. He sighed, rubbing his temple. Maybe he was just tired. Maybe the weight of today was playing tricks on his mind. He would sleep, he would wake up, and the memory of this strange encounter would dissolve like a bad dream. A sound jerked Richard awake. He sat up abruptly, his pulse spiking before his mind could fully register what had startled him. A voice. No, not a voice. A cry, a deep, sorrowful sobbing. His body stiffened, his instincts immediately shifting to high alert. He was alone, or at least he should have been. He reached for the bedside drawer, his fingers grazing against the cool metal of his handgun, a force of habit honed by years of precaution. But then he hesitated. Something about this sound. It wasn't the sharp intrusion of an intruder or the distant wail of the city beyond his walls. It was inside, and worse, it sounded familiar. He pushed off the blankets and rose, his heartbeat thudding in his ears as he followed the sound down the hallway, his bare feet pressing against the floor with measured steps. The sobs were rhythmic, almost deliberate, like someone reliving grief over and over again. The sound led him to the living room, and that's when he saw him. Daniel, the same boy he had sent away, now sitting motionless in the dark, his back to Richard, his small frame slouched as he stared down at something on his lap. A cold wave of disbelief washed over Richard, and for the first time in a very, very long time, fear curled around his ribs. How the hell had the boy gotten inside? He had locked every door, checked every window before going to bed. His home was secured with top-tier security systems, not the kind of place a homeless child, could just slip into unnoticed. His throat went dry, but his voice was steady when he finally spoke. "How did you get in here?" No answer. The boy didn't move, didn't flinch, didn't even acknowledge Richard's presence. The billionaire took a cautious step forward, his gaze flicking briefly to the object in the boy's lap. A photograph. Emily's photograph, the one from his desk. He hadn't noticed it was missing, but there it was, held delicately in the boy's hands as if it were made of glass. Something inside Richard twisted violently, a sensation he couldn't name but knew wasn't right. "I asked you a question," he said, his voice lowering to a dangerous level. He had no patience left for riddles. How did this child keep showing up where he shouldn't be? How did he know things he shouldn't know? Finally, Daniel shifted, slowly, like someone waking from a deep sleep. He lifted his head just enough for Richard to see his face. His eyes were glassy, vacant, like someone looking through him rather than at him. And when he finally spoke, his voice was eerily detached. "I told you." His fingers curled slightly around the photograph. She's still here. Richard's prickled. Emily is gone, he said through clenched teeth, his voice dangerously close to breaking. Daniel blinked, tilting his head slightly. Then why do you still hear her? Richard's stomach turned. He didn't hear her. He hadn't heard her in years, hadn't allowed himself to, had spent so much time drowning out every lingering echo of her memory that he had forgotten what it was like to even imagine her voice. But now, standing in the dark, looking at this impossible child, the question burrowed into his mind like a parasite. Why did this feel like something he had felt before? His grip tightened into a fist, but his breath came out uneven. "Get out," he commanded, each word carrying the weight of a man who had built an empire with nothing but sheer will. Daniel didn't move. His small fingers traced the edges of the photograph absent-mindedly. "She said you'd say that," he murmured. Richard's pulse slammed against his ribs. His mouth went dry, his mind screaming at him to walk away, to regain control. But he couldn't move, because he remembered something he shouldn't have. The last time he had heard Emily cry, it had been in this house. And yet he had convinced himself he had. Imagined it, that it was just the weight of grief distorting his memories. But what if it hadn't been? What if he had heard her that night, crying, calling for him? And what if, just like tonight, he had ignored it? His breath hitched. What had he forgotten? Daniel finally placed the photograph back on the table and stood, his small form barely casting a shadow. His dark eyes bore into Richard's with something unreadable. Then, without another word, he walked past him, heading toward the hallway. Richard turned, his throat tightening as he watched the boy reach the doorway. Before disappearing into the darkness, Daniel paused. He didn't look back, didn't move, but his voice was steady, absolute. "You should have listened the first time." And then he was gone. Richard stood in the middle of his living room, staring at the boy with barely restrained frustration. He had had enough. Enough of the cryptic words, the eerie silences, the way Daniel spoke as if he knew things Richard himself did not. It had been hours since he had found the child inside his house, and no matter how many times he had demanded an explanation, Daniel had given none. Instead, he lingered, moving through Richard's home as if it belonged to him, touching objects that he had no business touching, looking at things that shouldn't have existed. Richard's patience had long worn thin. He had spent his life exerting control, bending the world to his will, and yet this boy, this nobody, had somehow turned his own home into an unfamiliar place. "Enough!" Richard snapped, his voice firm, his jaw locked. "I don't know who put you up to this or what sick game you're playing, but it ends now." He gestured toward the door, his tone leaving no room for negotiation. "Leave now." Daniel didn't react. He didn't flinch, didn't protest. He simply stood there, watching Richard with an expression that sent a shiver down the billionaire's spine. Not fear, not defiance, but something far worse. Recognition. Richard clenched his fists. Why did the boy keep looking at him like that? He had met countless people in his life, powerful men, dangerous men, people who wielded influence like a weapon, but no one had ever stared at him the way this child did. It was as if Daniel wasn't just seeing him, he was remembering him. The thought made Richard's stomach tighten. He took a slow, measured breath, forcing the tension from his body. "You don't belong here," he said, his voice lower now, deliberate, "and I won't ask you again." Daniel's eyes flickered, not with fear, but with something unreadable. Then, as if Richard hadn't spoken at all, he lifted a hand and pointed toward the far wall. "Where's the other painting?" Richard frowned. His body went rigid, the tension snapping back into place like a rubber band stretched too far. He followed the boy's finger, gaze locking. Onto the wall Daniel was pointing at. There was nothing there, just a vast stretch of smooth, undisturbed surface where his carefully curated art collection had been displayed for years. His brows furrowed. What the hell was the boy talking about? He turned back to him, irritation spiking. "What?" Daniel's head tilted slightly, his expression as blank as ever. "The painting," he said again, as if it were obvious. "It was there." Richard exhaled sharply through his nose. There was never a painting there. But even as he said the words, something strange flickered in his mind. He had lived in this house for years. He knew every inch of it, had arranged everything exactly as he wanted, and yet something about the wall felt off. He couldn't explain why, but suddenly the space Daniel was pointing at didn't feel empty. It felt missing. Richard stepped closer, fingers unconsciously reaching out. The moment his palm pressed against the surface, a jolt ran through him. The texture was the same, the paint smooth beneath his fingertips. But beneath that, there was a gap, a barely perceptible indentation, as if something had once hung there and had been removed. He swallowed, his throat dry. That didn't make sense. If he had taken something down, he would remember it, wouldn't he? He pressed harder, his fingers trailing the outline of the space, and for the first time something sharp curled in his gut. It was real. Something had been there. He turned abruptly to face the boy. "How do you know that?" he demanded. "What did you see?" Daniel's face remained unreadable, but his answer was swift, cutting through Richard's spiraling thoughts like a blade. "I didn't see it," he murmured. "But she did." Richard's breath stalled. The room suddenly felt smaller, the air heavier. He didn't have to ask who Daniel meant. Emily. His pulse pounded behind his temples, his mind racing to make sense of it all. He had spent years locking his past away, compartmentalizing his grief, ensuring that nothing, no object, no memory, no ghost, could crawl back into his life. But now standing here in his own home, in front of a wall that had once held something he should have remembered, Richard felt a crack forming in his carefully built reality. His mind rebelled against it. This was manipulation, a trick. It had to be. And yet, deep inside him, something woke up. Something old, something that had been waiting. He forced himself to breathe, to steady the pounding in his chest. "You're lying," he said, but it lacked conviction. Daniel simply shook his head. "You forgot." Richard felt the words land like a physical weight on his chest. He hated them, hated the way they twisted inside him, threatening the foundation of everything he knew. "I don't forget," he snapped, the sharpness of his voice betraying the fact that, for the first time, he wasn't sure if that was true. His mind felt like it was unraveling, pulling him toward a memory just beyond his grasp. He clenched his jaw, forcing down the unease. He needed proof. He needed to know if this was real or if this child was nothing more than a well-placed illusion designed to break him. Without another word, he turned on his heel and strode out of the room, heading toward his private study. He had records, photographs of every piece of art that had ever hung in this house. If something was missing, there would be evidence. But as soon as he pulled open the cabinet where he kept his archived records, his hands stilled. His breath came faster. The files were neatly arranged, untouched. He flipped through them quickly, his pulse growing more erratic with every page he scanned. The records were there, the photographs of every wall, every painting. But when he reached the section of the house that included the living room, his hands froze. The image in front of him showed the exact space where Daniel had pointed, but where there should have been a wall bare and untouched, there was something else. A painting, large, framed, unmistakably real. And yet, Richard had never seen it before in his life. Richard sat at his desk, his fingers pressed against his temples, his mind still tangled in the events of the night before. He hadn't slept. How could he? His own home, his own memory had betrayed him. The missing painting, the space on the wall that shouldn't have been empty, and worst of all, the boy. That boy who wasn't supposed to be there, who knew too much, who spoke as if he had always belonged. The rational part of Richard clung to logic, demanding an explanation, but deep inside, a voice whispered something he refused to acknowledge. What if it wasn't the boy who didn't belong? What if it was Richard who had forgotten that he did? He exhaled sharply, forcing himself upright. He needed to regain control, to put an end to this insanity before it unraveled him completely. He needed that boy gone. Yet when Richard stepped out of his study and into the main hall, a strange stillness settled over the space. He scanned the house instinctively, expecting to see Daniel's small figure lurking somewhere in the shadows. But there was nothing, no trace of him. He moved through each room with careful steps, checking the kitchen, the hallway, even the guest quarters where he had last seen the boy before retreating to his own thoughts. Empty. The child was gone. Richard paused, his jaw tightening. He should have felt relieved. This was what he had wanted, wasn't it? To wake up and find that Daniel had left, taking his cryptic words and eerie presence with him. But instead of relief, a slow unease crawled up his spine. The boy had come and gone like a whisper, like something that had never really been there at all. And yet, something had been left behind. Richard noticed it the moment he entered his office again. A single sheet of paper lay neatly on his desk, folded, once untouched except for the weight of its presence. It hadn't been there before. He was sure of it. His heart thudded a little harder against his ribs as he stepped closer, reaching out with fingers that had steadied empires yet hesitated now. He unfolded the paper, his breath catching as his eyes scanned the document. His entire body went still. It wasn't just any paper. It wasn't another cryptic note, another piece of the boy's strange game. It was official, government-issued, stamped, sealed, a legal adoption document. And at the bottom, printed in clear, irrefutable ink, was Emily's signature. Richard's fingers tightened around the paper as he read the details again, his vision blurring with a sudden, pulsing headache. Adoption. Emily, his daughter, his child, had been in the process of adopting someone. Daniel. The name was there, unmistakable, confirming what should have been. Impossible. Emily had wanted to take the boy in. A sharp breath left Richard's lips, his mind scrambling to grasp the implications. He had spent years believing he knew every part of his daughter's life, had controlled every aspect of it, for better or worse. He had provided for her, protected her, ensured that nothing touched her that he did not first approve of. So how the hell had she done something this big without him knowing? His grip on the paper tightened further as his eyes flickered over the dates, the signatures, the final approval that had never come. She had submitted it. The process had been in motion, but it had never gone through. Why? Richard stood abruptly, the chair scraping back as he moved toward the shelves lining his office walls. He pulled down the thick file labeled Emily Hale, personal, his fingers flipping through the contents with growing urgency. Every official document, every transcript, medical record, personal correspondence, but nothing about an adoption. No letters, no emails, no legal notices, no communication with an agency. It was as if this document had never existed. Had she hidden it? Had she been afraid to tell him, or had someone sure he never found out? A cold realization settled over him. Emily had died before this adoption could be finalized, before this boy could be legally brought into her life. Had that been intentional? Had her death stopped something more than just a legal process? Richard lowered himself back into his chair, his mind a storm of questions with no answers. He tried to recall their last conversations, the months leading up to her death. Had she said anything at all, that could have hinted at this? Had there been someone else involved, someone who had guided her toward this decision? He had spent years believing he had buried his daughter with the truth of her life neatly folded away. But now this paper proved that her secrets had not been buried with her. They had been waiting, and Daniel had been the key all along. His grip on the document loosened as a thought hit him. With such force, it sent a chill crawling down his spine. If Daniel had left this for him to find, it meant he wanted Richard to know. It meant the boy hadn't been lying. Richard exhaled slowly, his mind warring between the fear of what he didn't know and the anger of having been kept in the dark. But above all, One realization burned through the rest. If Emily had fought to adopt this child, if she had hidden it from him, if someone had stopped it before it could happen, then maybe her death had not been an accident. And maybe, just maybe, Daniel knew why. Richard moved through his office like a man possessed, fingers digging through every drawer, every cabinet, every forgotten box that might hold answers. His pulse hammered, his breath was tight, but his mind was ruthless. He needed to know. He needed to see what Emily had been doing, what had led her to that adoption request, and more importantly, what had led her to Daniel. His daughter had spent her last months hiding something from him, and it wasn't just the boy. There was more, something deeper, something that had taken root in her life without his knowledge. He found himself flipping through bank statements, travel logs, security reports, anything that would tell him where she had been going, who she had been meeting. He knew Emily had always kept certain things from him, but this was different. This was intentional. It was a hotel record that gave him the first real clue. A list of payments under Emily's name, booked every other week for 3 months straight. The same location over and over, but it wasn't a hotel. Richard frowned as he read the address. It was a house, an old property on the far end of the city, in a district that hadn't seen real investment in decades. It didn't belong to their family, didn't show up in any of their legal holdings. Why had she been going there? And why hadn't she told him? He reached for his phone, dialing a private investigator he had used in the past, someone efficient. The call rang once, twice, then a click. "I need you to look into a property for me," Richard said, reading off the address. "Find out who owns it, who's been in and out of there, and why the hell my daughter was going there before she died." He ended the call before waiting for a response. He wasn't interested in explanations. He wanted results. But he wasn't going to wait. He needed to see it for himself. Richard drove to the address alone, gripping the wheel so tightly his knuckles ached. The streets grew narrower as he reached the district, the buildings around him aging, paint peeling, windows cracked. It was a part of the city no one cared about anymore. And yet Emily had come here, repeatedly. His stomach twisted at the thought. She had been alone, walking these streets. What had she been looking for? Or worse, who had she been running from? When he pulled up to the property, his chest tightened. The house was exactly as he had imagined it, forgotten. The kind of place people ignored, the kind of place you wouldn't notice unless you were looking for it. The front door was locked, but Richard had never been a man who accepted barriers. He pressed his shoulder against the wood, his weight shifting until the weak frame finally gave in with a dull crack. Dust kicked up around him as he stepped inside. The air smelled old, stagnant, as if the house had been holding its breath for years. He moved carefully, eyes scanning every corner, searching for something, anything, that would tell him why Emily had been here. And then, as he stepped into the main room, he saw the walls. They were covered in writing. Not just writing, markings, symbols, drawings, scratches dug deep into the surface. His throat tightened as he moved closer, fingers grazing over the ink-stained walls. There were dates, some crossed out, some circled, repeating over and over. Names, numbers, and messages, so many messages. He scanned the chaotic scrawl, searching for something that made sense, something he could grasp onto, and then he saw it. "He doesn't know who I am. Not yet." The words stopped him cold. His pulse roared in his ears. He took a step back, breath shallow. Who the hell had written that, and who was it about? His heart pounded in his chest as his eyes darted across the rest of the markings, the notes left behind like a trail of breadcrumbs leading to something he wasn't sure he wanted to find. Some messages were frantic, almost desperate. "If he remembers, it's over. Don't let him ask. She said he would come, but it's too late now." Richard's hands curled into fists. Who was he supposed to be? A name wasn't written, but deep in his gut he felt something ice-cold settle in his bones. Was it him? His fingers brushed against the ink again, his mind reeling, trying to understand. Had Emily been afraid, or had she been warning someone? He turned abruptly, searching for anything, any object, any clue that could tell him what had happened here. His foot hit something small on the floor, sending it rolling across the wooden planks. Richard bent down, fingers closing around it, lifting it into the dim light filtering through the broken windows. A key, old, rusted, its handle scratched as if someone had held it too tightly too many times. He exhaled, gripping it tighter. This wasn't over. It was just beginning. Richard's fingers curled around the key he had found, the cold metal pressing into his palm as he turned his gaze back to the chaotic scrawls covering the walls. His mind reeled, trying to grasp what exactly he was looking at. These weren't just random scribbles. They were frantic, deliberate. Emily had been trying to say something. He took a slow breath, steadying himself before stepping further into the room, scanning for anything else that might offer answers. There had to be something more. His eyes landed on a small wooden desk in the corner, its surface buried beneath stacks of old papers, scattered notebooks, and a tangle of dried-out pens. He moved toward it, his hands working through the mess with a precision sharpened by years of meticulous control. And then, beneath a pile of torn-out pages and discarded notes, he found it. A book, its leather-bound cover worn from use. The edges of its pages frayed. Emily's handwriting was on the first page. His throat tightened. Her diary. Richard hesitated for only a moment before opening it, flipping through the pages with a growing sense of urgency. Every single one was ruined. The writing had been furiously crossed out, deep, ink scratches cutting through her words with such violence that it was impossible to read what had been written beneath. Some pages had been torn out entirely, leaving only jagged remains behind. Someone, maybe even Emily herself, had wanted to erase whatever was inside. His grip on the book tightened. As he continued flipping through, each ruined page adding to the gnawing frustration in his gut. Why go through the trouble of writing all of this just to destroy it? He scanned the diary for anything salvageable, any words left untouched, and then he found it. At the very end, on the last page, asked. Beneath a series of wild, desperate slashes of ink, a single phrase remained untouched. If I disappear, he will know. He just needs to remember. Richard's breath caught. His heart pounded against his ribs, his grip on the book unrelenting. He will know. The words stared back at him, taunting him, daring him to understand. She wasn't just leaving a message. She was talking about him. A sharp tension coiled in his chest, his mind working furiously to process what this meant. Emily had written these words in certainty. She had known that whatever had happened to her, he would be the one to figure it out. But she had been wrong, because he didn't know, he didn't remember. And that single truth sent a cold, twisting fear through him, unlike anything he had ever felt before. His fingers traced over the inked words, as if that alone could extract their meaning. Had she been expecting this? Had she known he would eventually find this place, find this diary? Had she been leaving breadcrumbs for him all along, knowing he wouldn't understand until it was too late? His mind raced, grasping at fragments of memories, flashes of moments that felt important but led nowhere. There had to be something, some detail he had missed, some conversation, some part of his life that had been altered without his knowledge. His stomach churned. Emily had believed he already had the answers, that he just had to remember. But remember what? Richard swallowed against the tightness in his throat. Pushing himself up from the desk, the diary felt heavier in his grip now, its presence a confirmation of something he wasn't sure he wanted to acknowledge. His daughter had known something dangerous. And instead of coming to him, instead of asking for help, she had hidden it. She had left behind these cryptic fragments, these half-erased warnings, trusting that he would piece it all together. But what if she had been wrong? What if he had never truly known her at all? The thought burned, a cruel realization sinking in. Had he failed her before she had even needed him? His thoughts were interrupted by the soft creak of the floor behind him. His body tensed before he even turned, instincts kicking in from a lifetime of knowing when someone was near. And when he faced the doorway, his pulse slammed into his throat. Daniel. The boy stood there watching him, his expression unreadable. Richard hadn't heard him come in, hadn't noticed his presence until now. It was as if he had simply appeared. The diary was still clutched in Richard's grip, and for the first time, an unsettling thought entered his mind. Had Daniel known about it? Had he been leading Richard to it all along? The boy's eyes flickered down to the book in Richard's hands, then back up to his face. And then, in the same quiet, calm tone that had haunted Richard since the moment he met him, Daniel spoke. "She didn't want you to forget." The words hit Richard harder than they should have. She didn't want him to forget. The implication curled around his thoughts, suffocating. He took a step toward the boy, his voice sharp, cutting. "Forget what?" Daniel didn't answer immediately. He simply held Richard's gaze, his expression as still as ever. Then, finally, after a long, unbearable pause, he said, "You already know." The answer made Richard's stomach turn. He had spent his entire life relying on logic, control, certainty. But now, as he stood in the middle of an abandoned house, filled with his daughter's desperate attempts to leave him a message, he realized something terrifying. He had spent years believing he was searching for the truth, but maybe the truth had been inside him all along, buried, locked away, erased. And maybe, just maybe, Emily had died because of something he had once known. Richard sat in his office, staring at the mess of files spread across his desk. His hands hovered over them, reluctant to touch, as if whatever was inside these papers had the power to rewrite reality itself. He had spent his entire life building an empire on certainty, knowing everything, controlling everything. Yet here he was, grasping at fragmented clues, chasing ghosts, searching for a daughter he had already buried. The diary had left him with more questions than answers. Emily had been trying to tell him something, and for the first time, Richard could no longer convince himself that her death had been the result of mere tragedy. She had been afraid. She had been running from something, from someone, and whatever had led her to Daniel had been big enough for her to risk everything. Richard's chest tightened as he rifled through the folders, scanning names, numbers, financial reports, until his fingers stopped mid-motion. He lifted a single sheet from the stack, his pulse pounding harder as his eyes moved across the words printed there. Classified Research Initiative, Project Mnemosyne. His breath stalled. He had seen that name before, years ago. A long-buried, initiative. Nothing more than a blip in the financial records of his company. Something he had signed off on without a second thought. Or so he had believed. His hands tightened around the paper as he scanned the contents, his mind scrambling to make sense of the words. Neurocognitive studies, memory, suppression trials, subjects selected based on predictive psychological markers. His stomach twisted as he turned the pages, his heart hammering against his ribs with every name listed beneath the subjects involved section. The first few were meaningless to him, numbers, unrecognizable names, people who had been nothing more than data points on a report. But then his breath caught, his vision tunneled in on the last entry on the list. Subject Dro 427, Daniel. Richard's fingers went numb. His pulse roared in his ears, his grip tightening on the paper until the edges crumpled. Daniel, not just some street kid, not just some coincidence. He wasn't here by accident. He was part of something Richard had created. His stomach lurched as he flipped through the rest of the documents, his breathing shallow, his hands working frantically as if the answers might slip away if he didn't hold on to them. The details unraveled before his eyes, each revelation more damning than the last. Daniel had been placed in the program as a child. No recorded last name, no listed guardians. The notes were vague, clinical, cold, stripping him of any identity beyond the research itself. Memory, manipulation, psychological conditioning, erasure of identity for controlled behavioral outcomes. Richard's hands shook as he turned another page, and then, at the bottom of the report, a single note, handwritten in the margins. Subject was successfully integrated, but exhibited residual memory. Retention. Further observation recommended. A cold realization crept over him like ice seeping into his bones. This wasn't just a project he had approved. This was something he had built. His name was all over the financial records. The funds had been funneled through one of his subsidiaries, disguised under layers of bureaucratic misdirection, hidden so deeply within his empire that even he hadn't seen it or hadn't wanted to. He exhaled sharply, his hands curling into fists. Had he forgotten this? Had he pushed it so far into the recesses of his mind that it had been erased like the memories of those involved? The thought made his head spin, but deep inside, an even more unsettling question coiled like a serpent in his gut. Had Emily known? Had she found this before she died? Was that why she had been so desperate to adopt Daniel? Because she had discovered the truth? His chest, tightened with a sickening realization. That was why she had been killed, not because of an accident, not because of some random misfortune, because she had uncovered something someone didn't want her to know. Richard pushed back from his desk, his chair scraping against the floor as he stood, breathing hard. His own daughter had been silenced because of his own actions. The weight of it pressed down on him, suffocating. He turned, his body moving without thought, without reason, propelled by instinct alone. He needed answers. He needed to find Daniel, because Daniel was the only person left alive who knew what had truly happened. Richard didn't bother with his driver. He took the car himself, hands gripping the wheel like a man ready for war. He had spent his life believing he was untouchable, believing he was in control. But now, everything was unraveling, and the truth that he had created this nightmare was clawing its way to the surface. He wasn't sure where Daniel had gone, but he had a feeling the boy wasn't hiding. Daniel had led him here for a reason. Every step, every cryptic word, every silent gaze, it had all been deliberate, as if Daniel had been waiting for Richard to finally see. When Richard finally found him, the boy was standing exactly where he had last left him. Not in the house, not in some alley, but back at the cemetery, at Emily's grave. His small figure was still, his hands tucked into the pockets of his oversized jacket, eyes trained on the inscription carved into stone. Emily Hale, beloved daughter, gone too soon. Richard swallowed the lump in his throat as he stepped forward, his voice rough, barely controlled. "You knew I'd find it." Daniel didn't look at him. "Yes." Richard's fists clenched at his sides. "You were part of it." Daniel nodded. Richard's chest tightened, rage warring with something else, something far worse than anger. Did she know? The question was almost a whisper. Daniel finally turned then, his gaze meeting Richard's with a quiet intensity that made his stomach churn. She knew enough. Richard exhaled, his body rigid, his mind clawing for something to hold on to. "Then tell me," he said, his voice steady, even as the weight of everything pressed down on him. "Tell me what she died for." Daniel watched him for a long moment. Then his lips parted, his voice calm. "She died because she trusted you." The words hit Richard like a hammer to the chest. His breath stalled, his thoughts stopped, and for the first time in his life, he wasn't sure if he was ready to hear the rest. Richard stood rigid, his breath shallow, his entire body coiled with tension as he stared at the boy standing before Emily's grave. The world around them felt distant, irrelevant, reduced to the singular weight of the moment pressing down on his chest. His hands curled into fists at his sides, and, for the first time in his life, he wasn't sure if his anger was directed at Daniel or at himself. His voice, when he finally spoke, was low, edged with something raw, something he hadn't felt in years. "Tell me," he demanded, his jaw tight. "Tell me what she knew." The boy didn't flinch, didn't shy away. He simply stared back at Richard with those dark, unreadable eyes. And then, with a sadness that shouldn't have belonged to a child, he said, "You still don't see it, do you?" A bitter taste coated Richard's tongue. See what? Daniel let out a slow breath, his fingers twitching slightly. Before he whispered, "I'm not the secret, I'm the mistake." The words hit Richard with the force of something unseen, something vast and immeasurable. He felt his body go rigid, his mind struggling to process the meaning beneath them. The mistake. His pulse pounded in his ears, and without realizing it, he took a step forward. "What do you mean by that?" His voice came sharper now, more demanding, but Daniel only gave him a small, almost pitying smile. "You made me," he murmured, "and she tried to unmake me." Richard's breath caught. "Emily," the boy nodded. "She found out what you did." There was no malice in his voice, no accusation, just quiet, painful certainty. She tried to fix it, but someone stopped her. Richard's entire world tilted beneath him. His chest felt too tight, his breathing uneven, as if he had forgotten how air was supposed to work. "No," he said automatically, shaking his head as if that alone could reject the truth pressing down on him. "That's not possible." But even as the words left his mouth, something inside him cracked. Because wasn't this exactly what had been gnawing at him? The feeling deep in his gut that he had missed something, that Emily had been hiding something from him, not out of rebellion, but out of fear. Daniel watched him with unnerving patience, as if he knew exactly what was happening inside Richard's mind. "You were looking in the wrong places," the boy said, voice softer now. "You thought this was about me, about what I was, but it wasn't." He tilted his head slightly. "It was about what she found, and what they did to her, because of it." Richard took a step back, his fingers running through his hair as his mind fought to keep up with the impossible truth unraveling before him. Emily had found out about the project, about Daniel, about what Richard's own company had done to him, and instead of telling him, instead of trusting her own father, she had tried to handle it herself. A lump formed in his throat, thick and suffocating. She had gone alone, and now she was gone forever. Who? The question left Richard's lips before he could think. His voice was different now, not commanding, not angry, just broken. Who stopped her? Daniel looked away for the first time, his small hands clenching at his sides. "You already know." Richard swallowed hard, his heart pounding in his chest. His mind raced. Through every possibility, every person who could have been responsible, every name buried beneath decades of power plays and closed-door conversations. But deep down, he knew Daniel was right. He did know. He had spent years cultivating power, forming alliances, building something so vast that not even he could see every corner of it. But someone had. Someone had been watching. Someone had known exactly what Emily had been trying to do, and they had stopped her before she could succeed. His stomach twisted with a sickening realization. Hadn't he signed off on countless projects without reading the fine print? Hadn't he trusted the wrong people before? And what if this time he had signed his own daughter's death warrant without even realizing it? His breath was coming faster now, his pulse erratic. He turned back to Daniel, his voice hoarse, strained. "Why didn't you tell me sooner?" Daniel's eyes flickered with something Richard couldn't place. "Would you have believed me?" The answer came before Richard could even try to deny it. No, he wouldn't have. Not back then. Not when he was still clinging to the illusion that he was in control, that nothing happened in his world without his permission. But now? Now he was standing in the wreckage of his own creation, surrounded by the consequences of his own arrogance. He had spent so long looking outward for an enemy, searching for someone else to blame. But maybe the enemy had always been inside his own house. His knees felt weak, his hands shaking as he turned away from Daniel, his mind a whirlwind of memories, regrets, and unbearable truths. Emily had tried to undo the damage he had caused. She had tried to protect Daniel, and in doing so, she had signed her own death sentence. Richard clenched his jaw, forcing himself to breathe, to push past the suffocating weight of realization pressing against his ribs. He couldn't change the past, but he could still uncover the rest of the truth, and when he did, when he found the person responsible, he would make sure they paid for what they had done. Richard sat at his desk, staring at the files spread out before him, his hands gripping the edges as if holding on to something solid could prevent his world from collapsing entirely. His mind was a battlefield, memories warring against logic, against the life he had built on control, on certainty. The truth had always been there. Daniel had led him to it, not through force, not through manipulation, but by peeling away the carefully constructed layers of Richard's own denial. His daughter had died because of him, not indirectly, not as a consequence of his business, but because, years ago, he had ordered something done, something so monstrous that he had chosen to forget. His breath came ragged, uneven, as he forced himself to read the final document, the one that bore his own signature at the bottom, the order to silence Emily Hale. His vision blurred, his mind refusing to accept the letters on the page, the undeniable proof that it had been his own hand that signed away his daughter's life. Project Mnemosyne, Classified Amendment 7. His eyes flicked over the details, his stomach twisting violently with every word. Authorization for memory suppression, behavioral recalibration of subjects, removal of compromised assets. The wording was sterile, clinical, but the meaning was clear. Emily had been marked as a compromised asset. He had signed the approval, and someone who had simply been following orders had made sure she never spoke again. His fingers curled into fists, his knuckles white as the papers crumpled beneath his grip. He had killed his own daughter, the weight of it pressed down on him, suffocating. He pushed back from his desk, staggering to his feet, his breath shallow, his pulse hammering against his ribs like a beast trying to escape its cage. His mind clawed for an out, for something, anything, that would make this untrue. Perhaps the signature had been forged. Perhaps this was a setup, a deception designed to break him. But the deeper part of him already knew the truth. He had spent years overseeing every detail of his empire, controlling every aspect of his life and the lives of those who served him. Nothing happened without his knowledge, and if he had signed something, it meant he had known at some point, before he had chosen to forget. Daniel watched him from the corner of the room, silent, patient. The boy had been waiting for this moment, Richard realized, waiting for him to remember. His gaze locked onto Daniel's, searching for something. Anger, accusation, hate. But there was none of that. There was only sadness, and that was worse, because it meant Daniel had always known the answer. He had always known that Richard was the one responsible, and still he had brought him here anyway. Richard's throat tightened as he forced himself to speak, his voice hoarse, barely more than a whisper. "How long have you known?" Daniel tilted his head slightly, studying Richard the way someone might study a wounded animal, cautious, but without cruelty. "Long enough." His voice was steady, devoid of resentment, as if what he was saying was merely a fact, a thing that had always been true. Emily found the records. She tried to confront them. They stalled her, threatened her, but she wouldn't stop. He took a step closer, his small frame still, his expression unreadable. "So they came to you." Richard's hands trembled as he reached for the edge of the desk, as if steadying himself against the weight of what was coming next. "They came to me?" The words felt foreign in his mouth, distant. Daniel nodded. "They told you she was compromised, that she was a risk to everything you had built." His voice remained eerily calm. "And you did what you always do. You made the problem disappear." The room spun. Richard's breath came sharp and ragged, his mind flashing through fragmented images, glimpses of memories that had been locked away. He had known. There had been a meeting, a conversation. He could almost hear the voices now, smooth and persuasive, telling him what he needed to hear. "Emily has been compromised. She's emotional. She's reckless. If this gets out, everything you've worked for will crumble. We can handle it, but we need your authorization." And he had given it without question, without hesitation, because that was who he was. That was the man he had spent his entire life becoming, a man who never let emotions interfere, a man who handled problems. And Emily had just been another problem. A sharp gasp left his lips, his hands gripping his hair as if he could pull the memory out of his skull. His stomach twisted, bile rising in his throat, the sickening weight of realization pressing against his ribs until he thought they might break. He had been searching for a murderer, someone who had betrayed him, who had stolen his daughter from him. And the whole time, he had been hunting himself. A broken laugh escaped him, sharp and bitter, a horrible sound that didn't belong to him. "I killed her," he whispered, his voice cracking. His own confession. The words felt heavy, final, and yet he could not take them back. Daniel watched him, his expression unchanged. He had no reaction to Richard's agony, no words of condemnation or comfort. He had waited for Richard to reach this point on his own. "Now you remember," the boy murmured. Richard's vision blurred, his body trembling, the weight of everything threatening to pull him under. He wanted to deny it, to fight it, but there was nothing left to fight. The proof was right in front of him, his own name, his own orders, his own crime. His knees buckled, and he stumbled back against the desk, gripping the edge with white-knuckled hands. The room felt suffocating, too small to contain the enormity of what he had done. He had spent years convincing himself he had lost Emily, but the truth was worse. He had thrown her away. He had condemned his own daughter to death without even knowing it, and then he had erased it, wiped his own memory clean, rewritten his own history, so that he could live in blissful ignorance while Emily rotted in the ground. A soft breath escaped Daniel's lips. He stepped forward, standing just inches away from Richard now. The boy tilted his head slightly, his gaze unwavering, and when he spoke again, his voice was almost gentle. "Now you remember." His dark eyes searched Richard's, holding him in place as he whispered, "What are you going to do about it?" Richard opened his mouth, but no words came. His world had already ended. If this story moved you, share your thoughts in the comments. What would you have done in Richard's place? And don't forget to tell us where you're watching from. Here at Living Narratives, every story takes days of dedication to craft with all the depth and emotion you deserve. So if you enjoy this kind of content and want to keep experiencing powerful narratives with us, subscribe to the channel and turn on the notification bell so you never miss a new video. Your support means everything to us and keeps us motivated to bring you more stories that make you reflect and feel. Thank you for being here, and see you in the next one.